Good morning, U.S. historians. Today, I want to quickly go over some major concepts and themes that we're covering during week 3 of our continuing learning experience, or what seems like day 1245. Last week, you learned about the beginnings of the civil rights movement as the NAACP, the SCLC, SNCC, CORE all use different strategies to try to force local, state, and especially the national government to eliminate segregation, voter suppression, and other oppressive and racist laws. As we follow the timeline of this movement into Section 2 in the 1960s, there are a remarkable amount of victories as the civil rights groups continue to force the government to enforce the laws already in place that were being ignored, especially by southern states, and also to push the government for the first time in U.S. history to create new laws that codified protections and rights for especially African Americans. I'll quickly go over some major civil rights victories during this time that Section 2 goes in a lot more detail about. We have the Civil Rights Act of 1957, the Civil Rights Act of 1964, the 24th Amendment, which was ratified in 64 and outlawed the poll tax, the Voting Rights Act of 1965, and the Civil Rights Act of 1968. In 1961, CORE and SNCC volunteers forced the Kennedy administration to enforce the desegregation of interstate buses by traveling through the South and being brutally attacked. In 1962, the Kennedy administration protected James Meredith as he integrated Ole Miss. The Kennedy administration had to send federal protection for him because he was being threatened. The notoriously racist city of Birmingham, Alabama, was desegregated in 1963, only after many demonstrations, including 2 children's marches, where the fire department used hoses, which can break bones, just so you know. The image you see here is an image of one of the children's marches in Birmingham, as a local fire department is spraying the children with fire hoses. Also, the local police use attack dogs on African American children simply because they were marching for freedom. The March on Washington, which was partly organized by A. Philip Randolph, if you remember, he first proposed a march on Washington during World War II to protest African Americans not being hired in the defense industry. This happened in August 1963, and 250,000 people showed up to push the government to take a stand on civil rights. And this is where Martin Luther King Jr. gave a version of his famous "I Have a Dream" speech, which I'm sure all of you have heard part of before. Just so you know, he gave an early version of this speech before the March on Washington in Detroit, Michigan. And in the enrichment folder, you can find the entire speech that he gave in Detroit. If you're interested, you want to hear it. It's really cool. In 1965, after protesters were brutally beaten by police for attempting to simply march from Selma to Montgomery, Alabama, the federal government sent protection for another march from Selma. And more importantly, President Lyndon B. Johnson used this event to push the government to pass the Voting Rights Act of 1965. All these victories came at a huge cost. And as the 1960s progressed, many civil rights activists started to become frustrated as they felt like too many people were being brutalized and murdered for change that was happening way too slow and way not enough. We'll cover how the civil rights movement changed and became more radical during the 1960s and the impact of this change next week in Chapter 21, Section 3. Please keep turning in your work. And remember, if you have any questions or concerns, contact me via Remind, email, Schoology, or join my Zoom conference every Wednesday during my office hours. And until next time, stay safe and keep thinking.